It is the middle of the night. The ocean is completely flat. Not slightly calm, not mostly quiet. Completely still. The kind of stillness that experienced sailors find more unsettling than a storm. And somewhere in the darkness ahead, invisible, silent, something is waiting. Now here is what most people think they know about the Titanic. They think it sank because it hit an iceberg. They think it was the largest ship ever built. And almost every single one of those things is either wrong, incomplete, or concealing a far more disturbing truth. Because what actually happened on the night of April 14th, 1912, was not one disaster. It was 14 separate decisions made by 14 different people. This is not a story about a ship hitting an iceberg. This is a story about how the most advanced piece of engineering in human history was brought down by darkness, confidence, and a pair of missing binoculars. Belfast, Northern Ireland. The year is 1909. The sky is gray. The wind carries the smell of burning coal and hot metal. Every day, thousands of men walk through those gates, with their gaze low and their step heavy. Their clothes are already dirty before they touch their tools.
They are here to build something the world has never seen. But here is what almost nobody knows about the Titanic before it was the Titanic. It started with a dinner party. In 1907, J. Bruce Ismay and Lord Peary sketched out the concept of 3 ships so large, so luxurious, so dominant that they would make every other ocean liner in the world look like a rowing boat. The ships would be called Olympic, Titanic, and Gigantic. Notice that last name, Gigantic. It was later changed, after the disaster, to Britannic, as if the name itself had become dangerous. The Titanic would be 269 meters long, nearly 3 football fields. It would weigh 46,000 tons. Its 4 funnels would stand as tall as a 4-story building above the deck. Here is the detail that changes how you see those 4 funnels. Only 3 of them were real. The 4th was decorative.
It existed purely because designers believed a ship with 4 funnels looked more powerful and more trustworthy than a ship with 3, because appearance mattered as much as engineering. Remember that. It will become important. The shipyard at Harlandandwolff employed 15,000 men during the Titanic's construction. It was the largest workforce ever assembled for a single civilian project. The noise was described by workers as physically painful, a continuous hammering so loud that men communicated in lip reading and gestures. The heat from the furnaces reached temperatures that caused spontaneous bleeding from the nose. And the most dangerous job of all belonged to the rivet boys. These were children, some as young as 12, whose job was to catch red-hot iron rivets thrown to them by other workers and hold them in place while a riveter hammered them into the hull. They caught hot metal thrown through the air with their bare hands. 246 men died during the Titanic's construction. Their names do not appear on any memorial. They are not in any museum exhibit. Recent research has shown that in the bow section, the part that hit the iceberg and sank first, the rivets used were not the standard iron rivets. They were cheaper. They were made of iron with a higher slag content. The physical evidence from the wreck shows that when the bow hit the ice, those rivets did not bend. They popped, like buttons on a coat under too much strain. The hull did not crack open in a long gash as people believed for decades. It opened at the seams. The rivet boys may have unknowingly fastened together the exact point where the Titanic would come apart.
On the 31st of May, 1911, in front of a crowd of 100,000 people, the Titanic was launched. It slid into the water of Belfast Lough in 62 seconds. But here is what nobody mentions about the launch. There was no champagne, no ceremony, no bottle broken against the hull. White Star Line policy was not to christen its ships. The Titanic was launched in silence, without a name spoken aloud, without a blessing, without the ritual that maritime tradition had used for centuries to ask for safe passage. Workers who spent their days on board described an uneasy feeling. Not fear exactly, more like the sense that the ship was not yet fully real. Southampton. The docks fill before dawn. The air is cold and sharp and smells of the sea and engine oil. And there it is, all 269 meters of it, against the dock. Silent, motionless, impossibly large. People who were there that morning described the same thing independently. You could not see the whole ship from any one place on the dock. You had to move your eyes, like reading a page, to take it in. The passengers came from 33 different countries. They spoke 17 different languages. They ranged from John Jacob Astor IV to families from rural Ireland who had saved for 3 years for a third-class ticket. They were all about to share exactly the same fate, just not the same experience of it. In first class, you woke to a steward placing fresh flowers beside your morning tea. You had access to a swimming pool, the first ever installed on an ocean liner. A Turkish bath. A gymnasium with mechanical horses for exercise. A squash court 33 feet below the waterline. The Café Parisien, a replica of a French sidewalk cafe with real ivy trailing along the walls. Meals in first class ran to 11 courses. The wine list contained 44 different vintages. Margaret Brown described the first-class dining salon as the most beautiful room she had ever sat in on land or sea. Now go 3 decks down and through a locked gate. In third class, the conditions were still better than any other steerage on any other ship in the world. The third class had enclosed cabins, not open dormitories. The food was hot, plentiful, and served at tables. There were 2 bathtubs for 700 passengers, but that was considered modern. For the families traveling from Ireland and Sweden and Italy and Finland, the Titanic was not a tragedy waiting to happen. It was the most hopeful moment of their lives. They were on their way to America. They were going to be fine. They had no idea that the locked gates would become the difference between life and death. The first 4 days of the crossing were, by every account, perfect. The sea was calm. The weather was clear. The ship performed exactly as designed. And then, the warnings started arriving. The Titanic did not receive 1 warning about ice. It received 7. 7 separate wireless messages from 7 different ships. The first came on the morning of April 12th. A ship called the Coronia sent a message. Bergs and field ice in latitude 42. The message was delivered to Captain Smith. He read it. He thanked the sender. He did not change course. He did not reduce speed. He did not order extra lookouts. More messages followed on April 13th, and again on April 14th. The last warning arrived at 10:55 in the evening from the sscalifornian, close enough to see the Titanic's lights on the horizon.
Those were the last words the Californian's operator heard from the Titanic. He went to bed. Minutes later, his ship would be close enough to watch the Titanic's distress rockets from the deck. But here is the question the warnings do not fully answer. Why did the captain not slow down? The answer is complicated, and it is more human than you expect. Captain Edward Smith had crossed the North Atlantic more than 100 times. He had sailed through ice fields before. He knew the risks. But he also understood something else: the pressure. J. Bruce Ismay, the chairman of White Star Line, the man who had sketched the Titanic on a dinner napkin, was on board. Witnesses testified he had been pressing for the ship to arrive in New York a day early. Ismay denied it. Ismay always denied it. But the speed was 22 knots on the night of the 14th, in iceberg water, at night, without a moon. A cascade is what happens when a system fails not because of one catastrophic event, but because of a chain of smaller failures, each of which feeds the next. Failure 1. The binoculars. The lookouts had no binoculars. The binoculars had been in a locker in Southampton. The key had been taken away by a crew member who was reassigned. Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee stood in the crow's nest with nothing but their naked eyes. Fleet later testified, if we had had binoculars, we would have seen the iceberg in plenty of time. Failure 2. The temperature. The temperature of the air that night was -2 degrees Celsius. Water at that temperature does not create the white foam at the base of an iceberg that lookouts are trained to spot. There was no white foam, no breaking water, no visual cue. Fleet saw nothing until he was practically on top of it. Failure 3. The wireless traffic. 7 warnings, 1 operator, 300 personal messages. The last warning? Cut off. Shut up, I am busy. Failure 4. The turning maneuver. When Fleet spotted the iceberg, he telephoned the bridge immediately. First Officer Murdoch gave the order to turn hard to port and to reverse the engines. Reversing the engines on a ship like the Titanic reduced the effectiveness of the rudder. When you cut the propellers, you reduce the turning ability. If Murdoch had not reversed the engines, the Titanic would almost certainly have cleared the iceberg completely. Failure 5. The compartments. The Titanic was designed to stay afloat with 4 flooded compartments. The iceberg flooded 5. Not by punching a 90-meter hole, by popping the rivets along a 90-meter section of seam. The opening was, in total, the size of a small car window. The Titanic was sunk by a gap you could fit your arm through. The impact happens at 11:40 p.m. Below decks, men in the forward boiler rooms hear a sound they describe differently in every account. A scraping, a tearing, a grinding, a shudder. Above deck, in the first-class smoking room, men playing cards look up. One says, "We have struck something." Another says, "Nothing serious." They go back to their cards. In third class, at the waterline, the reality is different. The water begins coming in almost immediately. Quietly. Steadily. Impossibly cold. Captain Smith reaches the bridge within 2 minutes. He and designer Thomas Andrews go below to assess the damage. Andrews takes his calculations from memory. 5 compartments flooded. The ship can sustain 4. He looks at Smith. He says, "She will sink." Smith asks, "How long?" Andrews says, "An hour. Perhaps 2. Smith says nothing. He walks back to the bridge. He knows what this means. 2,224 people on board. Lifeboat capacity, 1,178. The mathematics are simple, and they are monstrous. The Titanic carried more than the legally required number of lifeboats. British Board of Trade regulations were written in 1894, when ships were smaller. Nobody had updated them. The Titanic was so far beyond the size of any ship those regulations were designed for that it sailed legally with boats for fewer than half its passengers. Every single safety regulator signed off because it was legal. The order to uncover the lifeboats is given at 12:05 a.m. The Titanic has been sinking for 25 minutes. Nobody on board knows the ship will sink. The first lifeboat launched, Lifeboat 7, has a capacity of 65 people. It is launched with 28 on board, nearly half empty. Because people standing on a ship that feels solid and warm and familiar, looking down at a small wooden boat being lowered into the black ocean 20 meters below, made a rational decision. The ship seemed safer than the boat. They were wrong, but they were not stupid. They were not cowards. They were human beings making a calculation based on the information available to them. By the time the reality became undeniable, by the time the bow was visibly lower, many of the boats were already gone. The musicians played. They were not ordered to play. They were not performing a duty. They made a choice.
Wallace Hartley gathered his 8 musicians because they understood. In the hour between knowing they were going to die and dying, what happened would be defined by whether they gave in to panic or held on to dignity. They played ragtime. They played hymns. The last song they played was either Song Stotom, a waltz, or Nearer My God to Thee. Every one of them went down with the ship. None of them had to. All of them chose to. At 2:20 a.m., the Titanic disappears beneath the North Atlantic. It is 2 hours and 40 minutes since the collision. Some could not get into lifeboats. The lifeboats were gone. Some would not. They could not believe it was happening. Some chose not to. Husbands who put their wives and children in boats and stepped back. The locked gates in third class, opened too late, meant that families who could not speak English, who did not know the layout of the ship, were still searching when the water found them. The water temperature was -2 degrees Celsius. Most of the 1,503 people who died did not drown. They froze. In the lifeboats, survivors heard the sound for an hour after the ship went down. 1,500 voices in the dark water, calling out. Then fewer still, then silence. The closest lifeboat, Lifeboat 14, under 5th Officer Harold Lowe, the only officer to turn his boat back toward the people in the water, reached the site 45 minutes after the ship went down. He pulled 4 people alive from the water. 4. Because the temperature had done its work.
The other lifeboats, the half-empty ones, the 2/3 empty ones, they did not go back. The survivors in the boats later explained that they were afraid of being swamped. It was a reasonable fear. It was also the fear that allowed 1,503 people to die within reach of empty boats. If all the lifeboats had been filled to capacity, an additional 473 people could have survived, who went into the water instead, because the boats were not full. At 12:45 a.m., officers on the Californian's bridge saw a rocket, then another, then another. 8 distress rockets in total. They were watching the Titanic. Captain Stanley Lord of the Californian was woken and informed. He asked, what color were the rockets? White, he was told. He said, a company signal, perhaps. He went back to sleep. Let me tell you exactly how far the Californian was from the Titanic. Between 10 and 20 miles. The Californian could have reached the Titanic, possibly before it sank.
The Californian did not move until 5:30 in the morning. By then, the Carpathia had been on scene for nearly an hour. The 705 survivors had been pulled aboard. The 1,503 dead were gone. Captain Lord went to his grave, insisting he had seen different rockets, that the ship he was watching was a different ship. The inquiries both concluded he was wrong. He had watched people die and done nothing. The RMS Carpathia received the Titanic's distress signal at 12:20 a.m. It was 93 kilometers away. Its captain, Arthur Rostron, did something remarkable. He turned his ship immediately. He drove his ship through the ice field in the dark at 17 knots for 58 minutes. He later said he had been in a state of calm certainty that nothing would go wrong with his ship. He was the only person in this entire story who acted without hesitation, without calculation, without delay. And he was also the one person who had no warning, no time, and no reason to be there at all.
Onto the Carpathia's deck came 705 people, wrapped in shock, in other people's coats, in blankets. Some spoke no English. Some spoke nothing at all. Some could not stop shaking for days. Some never really stopped shaking for the rest of their lives. Survivors described an inability to sleep near the sea, a terror at the sound of engines, a feeling when standing at a window that the floor was tilting. What they were describing had no name in 1912. Today, we would call it post-traumatic stress disorder. The inquiries called 82 witnesses and produced thousands of pages of testimony. They identified the failures, the missing binoculars, the speed, the ice warnings, the half-empty lifeboats. Enough lifeboats for every person on board every ship. Mandatory. 24-hour wireless monitoring. Mandatory. Reduced speeds in ice zones. Mandatory. Every one of these things became international maritime law within 2 years.
Every one of them had been possible before the Titanic. None of them had been done, because the Titanic was supposed to be unsinkable. And when you are unsinkable, you do not need to prepare for sinking. For 73 years, the Titanic lay undisturbed, 2 miles below the surface of the North Atlantic, in complete darkness, in water just above freezing. On September 1st, 1985, a joint American-French expedition, led by Dr. Robert Ballard, found it. What they saw on their screens stopped the team in silence. The bow section had buried itself 18 meters into the seafloor. It was largely intact. The grand staircase was gone. The wooden fittings consumed by organisms, but the steel frame remained. On the seafloor around the wreck, scattered across a debris field 2 kilometers long, were the objects of 2,224 lives. Shoes, hundreds of shoes, paired together where bodies had dissolved. A child's toy, a doll's head, a leather suitcase still closed, its contents intact, a pair of spectacles, a safe, unopened.
A menu from the first-class dining saloon for April 14th, 1912. The Last Dinner. The question of whether the Titanic is a shipwreck or a grave, a site for recovery or a site for respect, has never been fully resolved, and perhaps it should not be. Why more than a century later does the name Titanic still do what it does to people?
More books have been written about the Titanic than about most wars. It is not because more people died than in other disasters. It is not because the ship was the largest ever built. It is not because the technology failed. Here is what I believe the Titanic actually is. It is a mirror. It shows us something we recognize about ourselves. It shows us how human beings behave when they are told something is safe, when they begin to believe their own certainty, when the warning signs arrive, but the incentives point in a different direction. The Titanic carried 7 ice warnings, and the ship continued at 22 knots, because slowing down would have meant admitting that the plan was flawed. The Titanic is not a story about ice. It is a story about what happens when the desire to be impressive is stronger than the willingness to be careful. We have all been on that ship, not on the ocean, but in the decisions we make when we are too confident, moving too fast, with warnings arriving that we do not.
They are doing everything they were asked to do. They are there, they are alert, they are looking, they just cannot see far enough. Because the key to the locker was taken by someone who was reassigned. Because the regulations were written for smaller ships. Because the warning messages were buried under commercial traffic. Because the captain was feeling the pressure of a powerful man who wanted to arrive early. Because the rivets in the bow were slightly too brittle. Because no one wanted to slow down a ship that was supposed to be unsinkable. Because when you believe something cannot fail, you stop preparing for failure. On the 2nd of April 1912, the Titanic completed its sea trials. Every test passed. 8 days later, it was on the bottom of the ocean. The greatest engineering achievement of its age, undone not by one catastrophic flaw, but by a cascade of small ones, each alone manageable, each compensated for by the others, until the moment they all arrived at once. The 1,503 people who died in that water were not unlucky in the way we usually mean. They were the consequence of 14 decisions made by 14 different people, each of whom was doing something that made sense in isolation. The Titanic was not sunk by arrogance. It was sunk by the entirely human belief that the preparations we have made are sufficient, that the warnings arriving can be handled tomorrow, that the system we have built is strong enough to survive our confidence in it. In 1912, there was no word for that belief.